Tonight it's my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Edward Friedman, or as he said, call me Ed Friedman. He was born and raised in Brooklyn, the one in New York. Have you ever been to Brooklyn, Wisconsin?
I certainly have.
Does it feel like home?
I mean, the head of the Chamber of Commerce very well.
Wow. See, this is the problem making jokes with people who know more. He says he's very good friends with the head of the Chamber of Commerce in Brooklyn, Wisconsin. I drive through Brooklyn on my way home to Dixon. He went to college and got his PhD at Harvard University. He's been here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for a long time, and tonight, delighted to have him here to talk about the scientific forecasting of China's future. Please join me in welcoming Ed Friedman, Wednesday night.
So, I'm happy to be here. The goal is to turn you into scientific forecasters of China's future, obviously in a very crude and simplified way. All institutions care about their futures. All institutions do long-term forecasting. University of Wisconsin will do it. You have to care about it in terms of what it means for budget, investing, spending. You look into demographics. You think about how taxes will change. Anybody's going to do this. You think about China, one of the things you'll notice is that all the numbers show China is entering a demographic crisis. That is, China is going to be the first country in the world to grow old before it grows rich. Birth rates are already below replacement. Labor force is already declining. There's virtually no in-migration. That means that pretty soon the number of working people goes way up, and then goes way down, and the number of retired people goes way up. And that means it's tough to keep your economic growth going. The ratio of earners to workers, earners to non-earners will be worse in China than it is in the United States. This leads to what are called bearish forecasts. The Chinese economy is going to have a lot of trouble in the future. If you want to understand how to do forecasting of something like China's future, there's a wonderful book by a fellow named Daniel Lynch called China's Futures from Stanford Press. You can go read the book. Now, one thing we know, there's actually now studies of forecasters and who does well and who does poorly in forecasting. And there's one particular group of people that does worse in forecasting. It's specialists who know the future. What you learn is you should never bet on a future. You want to think about multiple futures, and you want to assign them probabilities. Eventually, I'm going to ask you to make 5 probabilities. That should add up to 100%, by the way. And we'll see how you all think about China's futures. The way you would do it is you would gather a group of specialists together, and they would argue about where they think China is heading. They would listen to each other debate these various futures, and then they would all assign probabilities, and we'd get some crowd truth out of that, which usually is better than any one person that you relied on. The people who do best in forecasting will not shock you. It's people who are actually impressed by changes in facts and who change their views when the facts change. Such people are rarer than you might think, or maybe they're exactly as rare as you think. Anyway, if you lived in China, the government does not permit negative forecasts about the economy. Actually, it's against the law to have negative forecasts about the economy. It will be considered to be an attempt to undermine the power of the Chinese Communist State. So all forecasts that come out of China are bullish, that they assume that China will continue to prosper and grow well. The future of the Chinese Communist Party is always glorious. It is always glorious. But here we're free to indulge in many more forecasts than just the future is glorious. Now, to get you to be able to make this forecasting, sadly, I have to introduce you to some facts. I will try not to overdo it. I want to make sure that you understand why it's possible to have a bullish forecast about China. China has grown on an average up to about 2 years ago over a 30-year period, more than 9% a year. It's rather fabulous. It went from a country which had over 40% of the population living in worse conditions than Burma to the country which has done more to wipe out poverty than any other country on the planet Earth. So with such a awesome record, and it really is an awesome record of growth, it's not surprising there are many people who have bullish views of China's future. Whatever the problems are, this government will find some way to solve it and will continue to have a glorious future. If you were living next to China in one of the other countries, you actually tend to be a bit worried about China's future as a wealthy and powerful country. There were a couple of countries in its neighborhood which love China and everything about it: Pakistan and Cambodia. Pakistan to balance against India, Cambodia needs China to balance against Vietnam. But otherwise, you'd be conscious that China has a vision that it is the great power of the region. It should be the dominant power of the region. You should be really to have your interests subservient to their interests, because they're really the most magnanimous people in the world, and you can trust them that if you rely on them, you will have win-win futures. For some reason, Japanese, Vietnamese, Indians, and others are not persuaded by this argument, and they don't like the thought that they could be economically dependent on China. They actually care more about their own futures, which requires their own independence. So you have a situation out there in the Asian Pacific or the Indo-Pacific region, without getting to why it would be, in which many countries are worried that territorial disputes could explode into really something very, very bad. One reason for thinking so is one of the most amazing changes in the world in the last 30, 40 years is that the global south, what you previously would have thought of as less developed countries, are now 50% of the world economy. We may be worried about the loss of industrial jobs, but that means that poor people all over the world have risen in extraordinary ways. And China is part of this amazing change in the world. Nonetheless, what that means is that other parts of Asia which are rising imagine their glorious future. And their glorious future isn't being dominated by China. It's their glorious future, if you will. So you have to be worried that really some bad things can go wrong when you think about what futures you are going to forecast. In addition, it is a fact that the Chinese economy is slowing. We don't have to go into why it is an obvious fact, but if you want one way of knowing it, it's oil prices. China was the largest purchaser of commodities in the world. The economy slows, it buys less, prices collapse. It really has a fantastic impact on commodity prices. A couple of months ago, there was an uptick in prices because the government was investing some money in coal, and coal prices and jobs and mines opened in West Virginia in the United States of America. China's impact on the world is extraordinary. It is an economic superpower. But as for the future, there is a view out there that says we are entered a period of what's called peak trade. That whereas trade in the past has been an impetus to growth in the economy, a trade is no longer going to grow. It is going to decline. You can figure out reasons just by listening to the debates in the previous election campaign. But it's going to decline. And so there are going to be much more polarization in the world economy. And one really has to worry about the future. They worry about it in China too. China suffers from polarization. There are many people in China who see the ruling group actually as corrupt people who only care about themselves and don't care about people like them. And these people have an opposition inside the Chinese Communist Party, usually called neo-Maoists. Book coming out called The Neo-Maoists by a scholar named Jude Blanchette next month, if you have nothing better to do. They believe that Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, an event which began in '58 and by 1962 had resulted in over 34 million innocent Chinese dying, never happened. That the story is a CIA black propaganda plot to discredit China. If you want to see the opposite, there's a great book called Tombstone, written by a Chinese gentleman named Yang Jisheng. Anyway, they also believed that the Cultural Revolution was great. It was an era of vigilante chaos, which hurt the life of about 100 million or so Chinese, with at least 3 million of them dying. But in the view of the neo-Maoists, it kept elites from ripping off the Chinese people. It kept corruption down, and that was a hell of a lot better than what China has today. These people seem to see China's growth not as a result of some good economic policies and good economic institutions, which it was, but as because the Chinese people are a superior race, they have superior quality, suzhi, and they think that China indeed should be the center of the world because Chinese are the superior people, and other people should respect China's interests. And their view of the Chinese government is very different from these Asian people who live around China who think that China is too expansionist, assertive, whatever. They think the regime is too soft. They think it lets China be disrespected by North Koreans and Vietnamese, and they want these people put in their place. So they see the government, I quote from one of them, as dominated by monopoly industries controlled by the children of senior officials. The current government led by Xi Jinping is very bad. So there's a lot of political struggle goes on in China behind the scenes, and what happens in politics can change China's future. It matters very, very much if these kinds of, I'll use my words, racist, chauvinist populists if they were to come to power in China, or if they don't. They think of Mao as someone who did stand up for China. He defeated the Americans in the Korean War. He defeated the Indians in a war in 1962. He defeated the Russians in border clashes in 1969. We don't have to offer competing views, but that is their view. And they want China to do the same thing right now and put the North Koreans, the Vietnamese, the Japanese all in their place. So if you're going to make forecasts, you have to think about what's going to happen in China. There is a lot of dissatisfaction about the regime in terms of its selfishness and its not caring about ordinary people. There's a lot more protests and mobilizations and clashes than you would think, since all you tend to see is a very strong state. But when they steal your land and leave you without nothing, or they build a polluting plant which you think is going to kill your children, you actually do go out in the streets and complain, and they do that in China too. You can hear I'm already giving you a variety of futures that are sitting out there for China. Some people think that the way the Chinese government is trying to delay the inevitable slowdown is by debt, by loaning money to institutions, firms, state-owned enterprises that really don't even make money, but it keeps people employed, it keeps the society stable. But the end result of that is going to be some extraordinary financial crash that'll make 2008 look like a Girl Scout jamboree. I don't claim to know the future, by the way, but these are what wise people tend to say. The regime tends to believe, I think, that it's very dangerous to carry out reforms in a short period of time and move China from an economy based on subsidization of industrial exports to one that's based on a more consumer economy. But China is becoming a more consumer economy. It has great consumer firms, and it's very innovative in IT. Firms like Alibaba, Xiaomi, cell phones, Huawei, and people who focus on this growing consumer economy tend to be much more bullish on China. There is no doubt these are very innovative, successful, and increasingly global firms. So what we have is a whole series of different possibilities, which I'm going to sum up in 5 probabilities, which eventually I'm going to ask you to make your probability predictions on. One is the bearish one. China wins. It means China will become the largest economy in the world. It will become the dominant economic influence in the world. Growth obviously will continue. It will very soon be a much larger economy than the United States. Second possibility, China loses. a bearish view. These debts are going to explode. This slowdown is inevitable. The demographic forces cannot be stopped. This nonsense about China becoming #1 is absurd. You should have a bearish view about China. Third view, 1 is too optimistic, 2 is too pessimistic. China muddles through. It may not become the greatest economy in the world, but it's really not going down the tubes either. I'm not sure if it will. It won't overtake the United States, but they're going to be just fine, okay? Muddles through. Fourth view, war. These tensions of the rising forces in Asia, people seeing their future being taken away and their neighbors. The only critique coming from these neo-Maoists who say that the government is too soft, war is virtually inevitable. The fifth is, no, China is going to democratize. Just so I hold in my hand. This is an article by Peimin Sin, who teaches in California, arguing that there is an inevitable transition to democracy coming in China. You have urbanization, you have a growth in literacy, you have people caring about their private property. They think the government rips them off. These protests really are occurring. That's what's going to occur. So those are the 5 things which I'm going to ask you to make probability picks about. Now, one last thing before you do it. If we had a serious conversation about doing forecasting, we would now begin another conversation, which we don't have time to do. And we would discuss what are called wild cards. And we would say, you know, there's a lot of change that happens in the world, and we learned from the study of forecasts is that it's wrong to get locked into your forecast that you think is true. It's a rapidly changing world. Imagine things which we haven't talked about which might occur, which would throw whichever forecast you make into a cocked hat. I mean, what would happen if, for example, let me really think widely. There's a new American president and he starts a trade war with China. What happens if Europe splits? What happens if crises in the Middle East split into larger wars? What happens if Russia invades Eastern Europe? If you begin to think about it, there's a lot of possibilities of events that could change it all. And then there's even a worse possibility, what are called black swans, what Donald Rumsfeld used to call unknown unknowns. They're events which seem so impossible that they're literally inconceivable. And yet they're going to turn out to be the most important events in the world. I give some examples. When Henry Kissinger first went to China, 1971, Mao era, total economic stagnation, he came home and he said to Mr. Nixon, there's one thing I can guarantee you, having just spent time in China, this country will never be able to economically compete with the United States. Don't worry about it. So you couldn't even imagine it. If you said it, they would laugh you out of the room at the time that you said it. And yet black swans, things which are unimaginable, because swans are, you know, all white, unless you're in Asia where there actually are black swans, by the way. Who could imagine the implosion of the Soviet Union before it happened? Nobody. And yet, when it occurs, it changes everything in the world for China. Previously, it had Russian armies sitting right on its borders. Instead, it has Kazakhstan on its west. And, I mean, that's less threatening than Mexico. And on its north is Mongolia, from which the Soviet military has left. China is suddenly totally secure. It allows China to go south and west into the Indian Ocean and out for oil in the petrostates of the Middle East. It creates a totally different China. The fall from power of not only the Communist Party, the Soviet Union, but all of them in Eastern Europe, totally impossible, inconceivable. They were totalitarian countries. The government had total control. There was no way that such a thing could change. If you would suggest that such a thing could change, we knew you were a crazy romantic who understood nothing about how the world worked. Before the U.S. financial crisis of 2008, there were actually economists who thought that something awful could happen in the mortgage industry, in the real estate industry, but they were laughed out of court by people who knew they were crazy and nuts. How do you put black swans into your equation? Well, you can't. They're unknowns, or there's no way of really thinking about them. So, as I said, I want, oh my God. If I left this thing here, I'm in trouble. Here it is. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to ask you some questions before you do the predictions and you ask me any questions. You're allowed to raise your hand, shout out answers. I don't care. The 4 largest importers of coal in the world. 4 largest importers of coal. Just give me names. India is number 1. China is number 2. Prizes for anyone who gives 3 and 4.
Korea?
Who said
North Korea?
South Korea? You have to have money to buy things. And number 3, that was 4. Japan. Notice anything about the 4 of them? Yeah, they're all out there in Asia. Rise of Asia. How many Chinese tourists visit France in a year? 2 million, okay. In 2014, the combined GDP of America, Germany, France, and Britain was $26 trillion. What was the combined GDP of China, Japan, India, and South Korea? Higher or lower? Higher, 33 plus trillion dollars. What country in the world is the largest purchaser of industrial robots?
China.
That is China. Despite the low wage labor, it is because of what's happened to the price of robots, it's more efficient, even in China, to replace workers with robots. And why wasn't that part of the conversation during the election? Between 1970 and 2012, China reduced death rates, remember it's wiping out poverty, per 1,000 population by 97. During that period, how much did India reduce death rates? China reduced it by 97 people per 1,000. India, higher or lower? Lower. 155, 50% better. It seems to me that your mass media doesn't do a good job informing you much about India, does it? 13 of the 16 most polluted cities in the world are in India. Yeah, I give you the answer, you're supposed to give it back. But according to the International Monetary Fund's forecast, by 2020, what percent of Asia's gross domestic product, with India now growing faster than China, I hope that's clear, what percentage of Asia's gross domestic product will be China? A number. 50%, even with India growing faster. China and the world. Which region of the world has the most negative view of China? Africa, Latin America, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Europe. Which country has the most positive view of China? You know, I'm not even sure that's true. Some people said China. What country has the most positive view of China? Pakistan is right. Who's the man who gets the gold stars? That's absolutely correct. Which country has, well, I'll change the story. In which country is the following adage popular? Aggression runs in Chinese blood, resistance in ours. Vietnam. Comparing the members of the Senate and the House in the United States with members of the two so-called legislatures in China, how would you compare the per capita income of the two bodies? Which one is per capita income higher? How much? 10,000% higher. 44% of the members of those Chinese legislatures are billionaires. That's why they call it a communist government. According to surveys in China, what percentage of mere Chinese millionaires, as well as billionaires, would like to migrate out of China? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Get a number? Throw out a number. 64%. What percentage already have left? 33%. Let's see what we got here. How did I lose that? I lost something here. What country in the world is the #1 trading partner of the most other countries? Gracious goodness. The United States of America. It is the largest economy in the world. You could read a book about that. The world's leading country in receiving remittances from abroad. It's people who've gone abroad sending money back home. Which country receives the most?
Mexico.
Mexico. Good guess. Wrong. What else?
Philippines.
Philippines, a brilliant guess, but not right. India, thank you, India, yes. Let's see. 7 of the world's busiest ports are in China. Where in a listing of busiest ports in the world does the Port of New York, New Jersey rank?
30.
Who said that?
30.
27. You sure? Where'd you get that? That is fantastic. That is absolutely fantastic. Most of the large American ports on the West Coast, they sell to Asia. Asia's rising. Remember that story? Okay. The top 3 sellers of smartphones in the world are Apple, Samsung, and Huawei is correct. Percentage of the world's merchant fleet that passes through the South China Sea?
80.
Over 50. Over 50. Who owns the American movie theater chain AMC?
China.
Thank you. Who owns Club Med? Okay. All right, so that's enough. We've learned enough about China. We've learned how you do forecasting. Your turn now to do the forecasting, okay? So 5 forecasts. You have to do this because I have to collect the numbers from you in a second. China wins. China loses. China muddles through. War, democracy. Think in your head. I can see no one has means of really writing down. Clearly not students in a class. All right, let's begin by saying, which of the 5 did you rank #1? Someone tell me which you rank #1 if you think most people agree with you. Yeah. Number 3, muddle through. How many muddle throughs we? Oh, what a bunch of cowards. These wishy-washy people. Just so I'll do my own, I would give it 16%. Okay, that's my probability for muddling through, 16%. Which one do you think you gave the least, which you think most people would agree with you is the least probable of the 5? Now this is one you have to think everybody's going to agree with you. Go ahead.
Democratization.
How many think democratization was the least? 5. I totally agree. I make that less than 1% in any foreseeable future. So we only have 3 left. It wins, it loses, and war. Anybody want to give me what your guesstimate would have been on war?
War with who? Yeah.
We're looking into the future. We're futurologists. Anyone want to? Anybody can be with, that's right. Thank you for, we're very tolerant, pluralistic, and open-minded here. It doesn't matter with whom. That has to be a big war. I can give you my word, there are going to be a lot of small military clashes. We don't count them. We don't count. We really mean war when we say war. Don't mean military clashes, okay? War. Anyone want to give me a percentage they think is close to where people would be on war? 10%. 10%. So I gave it 16%. I gave it the same as muddling through. Which leaves winning and losing. How many, well, give me a number that you thought would be reasonable for China wins, becomes number one, and so on.
38.
So gentleman says 35%. I gave it 34. I think that is the single largest probability. Maybe very hard for Americans to want to accept, but I think that is the single largest likelihood. Which leaves me with China loses, the negative thing, as 32%. So I was trying to make a point. I think the single largest probability is China wins. But the negative possibilities, war and China loses, the economy really collapsed, is virtually a 50-50 possibility. So if I were sitting with a group of specialists, that's what I would be arguing for. And of course, those silly people would be telling me why I'm all wrong and don't understand anything about what's happening. So let me just give you a last thought, and then I'll open it up to any questions that you have. Now, if you think back over what I just said at the very beginning, when we talked about wild cards and black swans, I actually told you that the exercise we just gone through was really a silly waste of time. Because the highest likelihood is that wild cards or black swans are going to be large events which are going to knock all our predictions into a cocked hat. And here's how you might want to think about that. That the speed of change in the world is going faster and faster. And you might think, well, let's imagine that you were working on genetic changes and you pick on some, Drosophilus fly because it reproduces very quickly. So if there are mutations, you can play games with mutations and you get more, and the mutations will happen more frequently. You speed up the process. An elephant, if it lives 600, a tree lives 600 years, but whatever, the mutant changes will come up less frequently. They have, okay, or Moore's law, technology changes faster. Well, that's happening with the world. So if previously one of these black swans occurred once every 100 years, they're now more likely to occur once every couple of years. And they are likely to be these large changes. And if we were to discuss these possibilities, remember, some of them we couldn't even imagine, the others we would be laughed out of the room for suggesting. That is the highest likelihood, which raises this question, why did I waste your time and go through this exercise of future probabilities when it's meaningless? And there's a serious answer to that question. Remember, the greatest danger is thinking you know for sure what the future is and being locked in. But we know the world is going to change. If you take the attitudes we've suggested, you're much more humble about what you think you know. You're not only more humble about what you think you know, but you're expecting there are a lot of possibilities out there. So when these inevitable changes, which I can't even know what they are, begin to occur, because your mind is more open to changing and you'll notice facts changing sooner, you will adapt more quickly. You will not be locked in. You will not call the changes anomalies, pay no attention to them. You will notice that they're happening. And that makes it far more likely that you will adapt much more quickly to the changes than to the people who, because they're specialists and really know how it all works, think they know what the inevitable future is. And I think that is the reality of our world, and not just about forecasting China's future. So I'm open to chatting about anything that you would find useful.
We worked with Chinese students that have come here to UW, and the number one thing they say to us is they believe their country is the most polluted in the world. So that's why I raised my hand in terms when you said
well, up to 3 years ago, they would have been right. I mean, I hated the rise of India because I used to begin my class by saying, name the country with 16 of the 20 most polluted countries in the world. And I would say China, but of course my friends in China tell me it's a lie because they lied about the other 4. But it's no longer true. India easily outpollutes China. So in terms of a fast-changing world in directions that you couldn't imagine, I include myself. I'm just a boat, you know. I would have been as wrong as anybody. It should be humbling as you think about these changes in the world. Yeah. Anything else on that? Yeah.
If the United States pulls out of the trading pact in the Pacific, as is promised day one, January 20th, doesn't that put China in a much more powerful position to prosper and dominate trade in the Pacific?
Not necessarily to prosper, to dominate. The United States is a big economic actor in the world. They do not want to lose access to the American economy. They love having their students being able to come here and learn the most advanced technologies. They're even willing to have their students become polluted or not even returned. This is a very smart bet that Deng Xiaoping made. It's very important to keep advancing up a high-tech ladder, and China's really investing in that, and this is part of doing it. I lost your question.
About the effect of the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Yeah, so China really is not interested in a trade war with the United States. You know, when they say out loud, if you do this to us, we'll do that to you, that's really a question that says, please don't do that. I mean, they have no interest in a trade. Nobody does. The consequences are immeasurable in what happens to the world economy, and my own guess, hope, belief is not going to happen. These are very interdependent economies, and I hate to say this, but there's a line in the United States: when you're seeking office, you run on a platform, and when you're in office, you run away from your platform. And that was not invented for Donald Trump. That's a general kind of. So my guess, hope, and China's too, is these things aren't going to occur. So China won't prosper if these negatives occur. It will become more dominant, but it doesn't prosper because it hurts everybody. It's a global economy. I read that in a book. Yeah.
Do you think one of the strategies used by President Reagan against the Soviet Union, he increased military spending, forced the Soviet Union to spend more and more, ruined their economy, and that created chaos, and they couldn't afford to run the Soviet empire? Can we do the same thing to China, because Trump wants to increase the defense spending and make them spend more and more, ruin their economy, and democracy can come about?
Oh, I love what's called virtuous cycle. All good things occur. I don't know that God. There's a lot of evil in the world. I read the book of Job. I don't want to get into an argument about the facts, but if one made that claim in Europe, everybody would think you're a very funny person. In Britain, in Germany, in France, they would all know that the Soviet economy was a disaster. And that's what did the Soviet Union in, that the arms thing had virtually nothing to do with it. That it was obvious to many people in Russia what was going to happen already in the early 1970s, when they couldn't even meet India's request for modern steel because they didn't have the chemical industry to do it, when they couldn't bail out Allende in Chile because they didn't have modern mining equipment. And they would think that the Soviet Union was going down the tubes because it was an economic disaster. And China is not an economic disaster. China is an awesome growth story. So it's very dangerous to do this. Second, China's military spending has been going up for 25 years, double digits every year. China would not be afraid of an arms spending race. The interests in China would be thrilled to further legitimate their ability to spend more money on the military. So I don't see it as doing in the Chinese economy at all. But the key point in here is you're going to talk about China, you really have to talk about China. And to me, there are two things that make the Chinese rise really different. One is they're in East Asia. Location matters. And they copied all the best practices from Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, for how you make money out of industrial exports. And they have institutions, I think of them as the Japanese system turbocharged. And that first makes them special. Second, in addition to location, is timing. They make their opening to the world market at just the right time. 1978. Petrodollars have been created. It leads to a beginning of the creation of cheap capital. The main thing poor countries lacked was capital. It's very expensive. They have cheap labor, but capital is usually expensive. Suddenly, capital is cheap and looking for outlets all over the world. And then there are revolutions in communication and transportation. So container ships, 747s, faxes and instantaneous communication. The cost of doing business at long distances just crashes. And that's one of the reasons the South rises, not just China, why the whole global South has this opportunity to rise. So they have these fantastic turbocharged policies. They're in a great location to plug into very dynamic neighbors, and the timing is fantastic. The interesting growth story right now is really India. So China could plug into all of these dynamic economies, right? South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. Who does India have as neighbors? Burma, Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan. I mean, it is Afghanistan. They would think of it that way, even though they don't have a border. How the hell has this Indian growth occurred in such a bad neighborhood? I mean, if you were going to invest money, better to invest it in a good neighborhood, right? That's true anywhere in the world. The Indian growth is really the interesting, but that's not what topic. What else on anybody's mind? Yeah.
You left out natural disasters, climate change.
Absolutely. So
disease.
let's do the climate change one, or let's talk about it environmentally in general. So I, as opposed to you, am really a useless old person. I grew up before one learned to think seriously about environments and climate, so I'm a dinosaur on that topic. So I accept as a fact that I don't know how to do that discussion. But what is clear is China has incredible soil and water pollution. We're always focused on the air. But incredible soil and water pollution. And the consequences of this in the long run, whether you try to pay to turn it around or you're going to suffer the consequences of it, everybody says are very, very high. China has very serious potential water problems, which are just absolutely mind-blowing. And potential causes of war, because most of the great rivers of Asia come from where? The Himalayas, which since China's army marched into Tibet, is part of the People's Republic of China. It is part of the People's Republic of China. China wants to dam all of those rivers. It really doesn't care if that upsets India, Burma, Vietnam, countries in Central Asia. Rivers go in that direction also. This really upsets their neighboring countries. They really think that, by the way, the international law is totally on the Chinese side. You control the headwaters. You can do anything you want according to international law. China on this is in no way.
But all those snow-fed, glacier-fed rivers are going to disappear?
They are disappearing. I've been in the Himalayas. I've watched them disappearing in front of, I mean, it's at that speed that it is occurring. They are absolute. So I can't give you a good answer to you, but I accept your question as being a correct question, okay? And take that as another black swan that I don't know how to put into the equation. Questions can be better than answers. Yeah.
Sort of a different tack and maybe a positive. I mean, for 50 years or so, China has been limiting the number of births, specifically to decrease in population. And now you're saying that that decrease in population is causing a disaster. So have they not planned for this, or what's the story? What over the last 50 years have they been kicking this up?
So let's do this in a couple of ways. First, your basic point is accurate. So we'll take that as a fact. But the real horror of the population control policy was not the population control. What it did is it empowered a bureaucracy, the population control bureaucracy, which suddenly had control over what happened inside of everybody's family. You were blackmailable. You could, I mean, the families ripped apart, mothers who have their children taken away and sent to orphanages. The real focus in terms of you want to see the horror of the situation is actually not the numbers of people, but what happened in those families. The second, a lot of urban people in China, limited by the population control policy, actually illegally adopted girls who came out of the, far more than foreigners adopting China. Because in a Chinese view, a good family has one dragon and one phoenix, male and female, both. That's a complete family. And so a lot of Chinese did that. Many families in China kept their kids off the books, sent them out to family members elsewhere. The real problem with those people is then they don't have registration, they can't go to school, they can't get their kids to school, they don't qualify for health care, but there's more of them around than you would think. Chinese have a saying, the government has its policies, and we have our ways of getting around the policies. One of the problems with the word totalitarian, it takes away any agency from human beings. Human beings care about family and so on, and they will do things for family and so on. Nonetheless, I said your basic point is right. They passed the tipping point. It's irreversible. It doesn't matter if tomorrow they said have 20 children. These forces are really in place. Estimates are that by, shows you what long-range forecasting and demography does, if you want to believe long-range demography, that by the end of this century, Chinese population will be at most 1 billion. It's really going down. And American population will be about 500 million. We're continuing to grow. Very interesting because it means that in terms of China catching up with the United States, it has to reach per capita income half of the United States, which is not so easy to do for China over a long run, which is good for those of you who are muddle-throughers. So something on your side. Yeah?
What's that similar projection for India?
I don't know. India definitely becomes the most populous country in the world. I don't know what the long-term projection. That's very soon.
Okay. And Indonesia, I think Indonesia.
Indonesia's continuing to grow. Economy's still doing fine in Indonesia too. I mean, there's a million problems, but basically it's still doing fine. This is part of the rise of the South. If you want to think about Muslims, just for the heck of it, name the 4 countries in the world which have the largest Muslim populations.
Indonesia.
Indonesia 1, 2, 3, 4.
Pakistan.
Pakistan 2.
India.
India 3.
Bangladesh.
Bangladesh 4. Arabs aren't even there. Who knew? Read the American press all the time. Who knew not that one of them was Arab? What else on anybody's mind? What is China doing this at which day? So let me try to do this in a long view. So there is no doubt that the implosion of the Soviet Union that I mentioned before changes the world. It not only makes China's north and west secure. Up to then, China's military was all on its north and west, confronting the Russian military, which, by the way, was an aggressive, that is forward-moving place. But at the same time, China discovers that it's going to have to start importing oil. You find this hard to believe, but the Chinese actually thought when the oil price spikes occurred in the Middle East in the 1970s, that China was going to be the Saudi Arabia of East Asia. It had no understanding of the demands for energy of a modernizing economy, and was shocked in 1993 when the petro state-owned enterprises came to the leadership and said, hey, we have to go out and get oil because we're not going to have enough oil to run our vehicles or our factories or our electricity and whatever. And the response of the leadership was, these SOBs are just trying to line their pocket by getting money from the state. We can't have an oil crisis. By the way, the leaders were correct. Because China had the foreign exchange, it could buy oil at any price on the world market. It really didn't have to go out and do these things. But it felt it did because they actually don't trust the world market. They seem to only trust their firms, and so these firms went out to make a lot of money. So since it's in the news, Venezuela, China gets oil. China has oil firms in Venezuela. What percentage of Chinese oil in Venezuela goes to China? Why would it? What ocean is Venezuela on? The Atlantic. What ocean is China on? If you ran the company, would you pay the price? Or would you sell it to the Europeans and make money? Of course you sell it to the Europeans and make money. Price is controlled in China. So China gets a lot of bad publicity from its oil dealings in Sudan and South Sudan, which it should get, by the way. It's totally legitimate to criticize them. What percentage of the oil from Sudan, which is on the Indian Ocean, at least South Sudan can get there through a pipeline, goes to China? Well, I'll put the question another way. Who does most of that oil get sold to? It's a fun question. Anyone who gets this right causes me a heart attack. Who does most of the oil go to?
South Africa.
Japan. Because Japan will pay good money for it, and the Chinese price is controlled. Now, I don't want to shock you, but there really is a world market, and Chinese firms try to make money. This is shocking, maybe shocking, but it is how the world works. Yeah.
Can you speak to the unionization of Walmart workers and why the government's allowing it?
It's not a Chinese business. It's a foreign business. It's okay to cause trouble for an American multinational. You really shouldn't try to do it in a Chinese business, however. Yeah.
I'm worried about the cybersecurity. They could cripple our grid, and it would bring us to our knees, and knock us back into the cave age. Why are we doing this? Protect us.
Oh, that's secret. You don't know anything. But please don't think the United States is. China can freeze our electric grid and return us to the caveman age. But the United States can do the same, at least to China. I mean, you really don't want this kind of. Which country, here's a fun, which country in the world is most terrified about Chinese cyber theft of technology, patents, all sorts of economic secrets? Which country in the world most worries about that and sees it as a potential disaster for its economy? U.S., no. Japan, no. India, no. In what part of the world is China least popular? Who's the central power in Europe? Germany. Germans are terrified that this is what is going to happen to Siemens and Mercedes and so on, that it'll come back into China. They've already stolen German high-speed rail. They've already stolen German solar battery production methods. Germans are totally terrified. This is the core of what makes their economy work. American view of technology is very different than the German. American view of technology is you want to stay ahead, you have to stay ahead. You have to keep innovating. German view is crown jewels. We have things that other people have, and if we lose them, we lose everything. We can't let them be taken from us. Very different. So they are the ones who are really terrified. America, if you do these global comparisons, you'll find is pretty dull. It comes out in the middle of a lot of these kinds of studies, if you will.
Not for long.
Yeah. That could be true too.
As someone who knows little about China, the extent of their soil and water pollution, it came about from lack of accountability in the party, a cost of doing business for development. How did it get to that point?
I tell you, everything you're saying is right. The easiest phrase, which is used all the time, is growth at any price. That suddenly people who had been very poor, where there was hardly any money in the economy even at all, had fantastic opportunities to make money. And the way people would think about it is they looked at the life, next level down, looked at the lifestyle of the leaders. And the leaders lived pretty damn well. They had all the best of everything. And so I said, well, I shouldn't have that, but a little bit less on down the ladder. So you eventually get to a point where at various levels, people are buying office. This occurs all over China on the thought of how much money can I make before I get out of office, and everything looks like an economic opportunity. Now, one aspect of that, growth at any price. If they did get growth, everybody's looking for an opportunity. Everybody's investing. Everybody, I mean, it is like a Wild West market. There's no limits on it, but it is an economy that is producing, and it gets fantastic growth at a particular price, which you're mentioning. Now, what's really happened now is it can no longer get growth that way. That, for example, China produced, at the peak, over 70% of the world's steel. But there was no one to buy it. What, you're going to shut down the steel factories, put people out of work, destabilize the society? What are you supposed to do? They really have a crisis. The old model doesn't work. All of these problems have risen and deepened, and they're trying to buy off the problems by throwing money at them, which keeps the factories going and keeps the people employed, but is really leading to firms which produce less than they actually are investing. The private sector is still going ever more, making more profit, but the state-owned sector is heading in a negative direction, and they're continually being bailed out. What people, the economists that I trust, say that that kind of a debt situation is not sustainable. That there has to be some explosion eventually which comes out of it. The Chinese government's bet right now is that they can create enough growth and have enough foreign exchange put away that when that crash occurs, essentially, that they will be able to buy out the people who are in trouble, and there'll be stagnation for a period of time, but they'll be able to get through it. That the main thing, therefore, is now to not do these large reforms to another economy. Keep things stable, let that consumer economy keep growing, the Alibabas, Huawei's, and Xiaomi's of the world, and somehow we'll get through it. That's I think the regime is in the muddling through mode. That is, if we asked Xi Jinping here, he'd vote for the muddling through and be sure that it was going to succeed. But it's why I put the bearish view that it explodes much, much higher. See, it seems unsustainable to me, unless it is. I don't know the future, you know. God does not talk to me.
And I just wonder whether you think that the hegemonic activities of China will continue. And even though it angers its neighbors, it seems to be very productive. And yet they, from what I can see, are not stopping the building of all these islands and militarizing the whole area. Will they continue? And if that's the case, what do you think the United States government is going to do about that?
I'm actually going to answer all the parts of those questions as long as everyone understands that these are my best guesses and that I really don't know the answers. So, absolutely they're going to continue. I don't even think, this isn't even a question, because the opposition comes from people inside the party who think they're too soft and weak and aren't doing enough in the hegemonic direction. I mean, if you walked inside the regime, people would say, how are you letting little disgusting North Korea cause all these problems for us? And people think we're in favor of nuclear proliferation and we look like ghouls. I mean, we just hate that regime. We would like to do, we couldn't, do you know how much we hate the problems that regime caused? People think that China loves North Korea. Need a psychiatrist. But they're not going to abandon them. They're not going to abandon them. Why aren't they going to abandon them in terms of their view of the world? The world is about struggles for power. And China has a choice, winning or losing. And it intends to win. if it really were wanting to do something about the problem in North Korea, the result would be the North Korean regime would collapse, Korea would be reunified under the Seoul government, and a united Korea would be a democracy with a military alliance to the United States and American bases in Korea. No, that's not what China wants to happen. And so, since that is a far worse outcome, as the Chinese regime will see it, than the problems that they have with North Korea that they hate, they're locked in. They're just a bunch of people in power like in other countries. They have far less room for maneuver once you walk into their situation, as I think Trump will find out too, than you think you have. So they think it is China's time. China's time. China was the glorious center of the world for centuries. By the way, that's not true, but that is the view. It was the glorious center of the world for centuries. It had a bad century, which was caused by the imperialists, which is also not true. And now it is our turn again. The world is returning to its natural, correct place, which happens to be good for China. It's also good for the world. It's sort of a General Motors kind of story. It's good for General Motors, it's good for the country. What's good for China is good for the world. That is so presuppositional. And the awareness that if it's anybody else, Japan, I mean, they're immoral, forget the conversation. The Americans, they're greedy and selfish. They cause wars all over the world, forget it. China is the only moral alternative that there is. They're absolutely certain about that. Besides which, they're winning. By the way, I think that's a fact. I don't think that's just they're winning. The Dalai Lama is welcome nowhere in the world anymore. China was very upset about it. Now you choose to respect China rather than the Dalai. They see democratic values being sacrificed for good economic deals with China. Why should they think anything other than they are going to win? So your last part of your question, so what can America do about that? I think very little is the reality. I mean, let's take, since you raised it with the South China Sea, how many of you are in favor of going to war with China because it seizes a reef in the South China Sea? Can I see hands? I think that's the case. So who is there, by the way, I think that's a few in the American government too. So you do everything you can to deter China from this continuous expansion to the south, but who's going to stand up to China as it expands? Well, there actually is one country that might. No, I gave you the quote. Aggression runs in their blood. Vietnamese. So some country has sold Vietnam submarines, which can indeed destroy Chinese oil rigs in Vietnamese territory, etc. But which country sold Vietnam those submarines? Russia, China's buddy. Who sells India more advanced weapons than it will sell to China? Russia. Well, Russia's interesting too, turns out. Anyway, Vietnam's the only country. The Vietnamese really, really believe they're in a quandary. They don't want to be dependent on the United States. First, because you Americans are unreliable. God knows what you're going to do tomorrow. You elect another president, God knows what his policy. Why don't you get a dictator who I can rely on for a long period of time so we know what your policies are. Second, you get too involved with those Americans and they're likely to bring up human rights and say, where's religious freedom? Americans, God knows when they do it, they're usually not very serious about it, but every once in a while they do that stuff. Who needs that, right? Who needs it? So there are many people in the Vietnamese Communist Party who will say, the best deal is to make a deal with China, just like China said. And others in the Vietnamese party will say, absolutely not. The whole history of Vietnam for millennia has been resisting Chinese conquest. What the hell did we fight and sacrifice if not for our independence? We're not going to give up our independence. And they have a lot of curse words they can say for Chinese because they've been doing them for millennia. So they can say all of those words. So Vietnam, I think. So here's a fun question. Which country is Vietnam's closest friend in the world? Which nation is Vietnam's closest friend? Well, that would have been right if it was 1980 something. But Cuba really was in the 1980s, but not today. 1980s would have been a right answer. India. India. India has been buddies with Vietnam since 1954. It's a very tight relationship. India has military relations with Vietnam. Vietnam accepts weaponry from India, Japan, Russia. The United States? No. It's illegal for Americans to sell weapons. How can you rely on those Americans? Anyway, so Vietnam is the one country which one can imagine saying, we'll pay the price, but this is the only way to save the future of Vietnam. So I think what American policy actually has done, not so far away from what the Chinese say actually, is to try to say to these countries that might do something to resist, we've got your back. Well, we're at your back. I don't know where. You know, I'm not sure we do. The United States definitely does not want to see an Asia which is dominated by a China that the nations of Asia don't want to be dominated by. That's a serious point. If, for example, China gave up those expansionist ambitions, and it said, as many reformers in China have been promoting for over a quarter of a century, let's tell our neighbors we're putting territorial issues aside. Let's just drill and share the oil. We'll get all the energy we need. We will not be a threat to anybody. No one will invite in the American military. We are, therefore, the most influential country in the region, welcome in the region. This is really what's in our interest. Since I first read an article in a journal called Management and Strategy, Guanliu Zhanluo. Since I first read an article on that in 1991, a mystery to me why that doesn't win out. It makes such sense. Yes, this is China. So this is the point to the beginning. They're not giving up the desire for the dominance, for the hegemony, because that's what they really believe in. Because if it was just a matter of, say, interest in some way, there really is a much better policy which has been offered inside of Chinese think tanks for over a quarter century. And it is turned down all the time because of this view, if China's going to be a great power, maritime Asia has to be a Chinese lake. And they actually use this term positively in the writing. It's our Lebensraum. It's our, they read German, Lebensraum is not a word which began with Hitler. It comes out of German geostrategists of the 19th century. They read German geostrategists. They're very well educated on all of these international strategies, far better than we teach our people in terms of a more global view of these kinds of things. So I think they're very serious about the goal of becoming the central power.
You mentioned how many people have already left China and how many, even like twice as many, still want to leave. Does China have any policy on taking wealth out of the country?
Oh yes, oh yes. The Chinese government is very worried. They lost over the last 18 months $1 trillion fleeing the country. That's money, $1 trillion. You know, it's more than most of us make in a good week. And it's very clear that Chinese, who are very creative people, find endless ways to get their money out. So, for example, you buy a really expensive insurance policy on which you can cash in Hong Kong. And that's not sending money out of the country, that's just buying insurance. What possibly could be wrong with that? So they're trying to crack down on these kinds of things right now. They're very worried because they think of the possibility that that financial crisis could happen. And they really do believe, I think the number they have in their head is they need at least $1.5 trillion to bail themselves out were that to occur. So they really don't want a continuing outflow of money from the country. The problem is that the ruling group is a network which includes all of these wealthy people who always have at least some member in the party who protects them. And so if they really are serious about carrying out this stopping the outflow of money from China, they're going to be hurting their family members It's their family members. It's the ruling group's family members who are doing this kind of thing. It's a split within the ruling party. So making it actually happen is a lot harder than it seems. But yes, if you were to have a conversation, they are absolutely terrified of capital flight and are doing everything they can, new measures every day, to try to stop it from happening.
What do you see for the quality of their manufacturing and merchandise? And if you see it trending like better quality? Like
Better, better, better.
And when do you see that coming around to then compete heavily against our?
Germany
manufacturing?
is the country, but yes, the answer to your country is yes. They measure themselves against what they see as the world's best because they intend to be the world's best. And it is their goal by hook or crook, meaning cyber theft as well as buying license, innovating themselves and so on, that they intend to go in that direction. And all signs to me, I don't see them as locked into low end. I see them as going ever more into that higher end stuff. Now, there are a lot of people who don't see China succeeding in that effort. I shouldn't just talk about me here. Probably if you had, this were a meeting of specialists and we were making our forecast, the majority would take the position that they can't succeed. And they would tell you that China is trapped in what is called a middle income trap. And it can only reach a certain point. At that point, it's not going to be able to go any further. You can see this because their research and development is mostly corrupt. Their patents are mostly trivial. And that's why there's so much cyber theft. And there's simply a limit to what you can do with that kind of thing. And so I think a majority, if you want to read a very good book which makes the argument, I'm not going to remember the title, but I remember it was Richard McGregor, who's a financial columnist for the Financial Times, a quite excellent book, which he will make the argument for you, is that China is locked into the this middle income trap. I will confess that I actually experienced that as a racist argument. I just can't imagine why Chinese are incapable. Yeah, a lot of money is going to be wasted because it's corrupt and so on, and a lot of money is going to be money down the toilet, as you almost expect from how the system works. So they're not going to get it at the cheapest price, but they're going to get it. They're already getting it. I can't imagine that they don't succeed in this effort. You know, as I said, China is China. You got to open your mind to the complexity of the yays and the nays inside of China. If it has this awesome growth, it has to come from somewhere, and you got to take it seriously. And yes, it also has these awesome problems. And that's why you could have a good debate in forecasting futures in which winning and losing look like equal possibilities, at least to me. So I don't know what the future is. I'm not going to try to make believe I do. I don't think it's knowable. It largely depends on what happens, I think, inside Chinese politics. And you can't predict politics. Name a particular event recently in the United States if you want to predict that. But you can predict politics. There are too many contingent variables happening at one time in anybody's politics.
Any other questions? If not, thank you very much.
Thank you.